Hey guys, it's been about 2 weeks since Riot tried to reverse the red side, blue side disparity, and unfortunately I'm here to say that in high elo the problem has just reversed itself, and so we can see that currently, unfortunately, the blue side now has a 53.5% win rate, so we'll be looking to see if Riot tries to make some adjustments to this in order to reverse it. Now, to be fair, for lower ranked players, it's really not something to worry about too much. It's much less noticeable at lower ranks, with blue side having, you can see here, a 51.8% win rate in Iron Plus, in Gold Plus 51.6, and blue side actually had a slightly higher win rate in lower ranks before they made the change as well. So even when red side was OP, blue side had a slightly higher win rate in lower ranks. So I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you're, Masters Plus. Even in Diamond Plus, you can see it's only 51.5%, which is really not too bad. It's really in high elo where it starts to become a problem. And then, of course, this brings us into some climbing strategy, which is people would dodge their games on blue side when red side was OP in order to win more games. And now you can do the same thing, just the opposite way around. So if you dodge games where you're on red side, you're going to have a much higher chance to win on this patch. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was Riot also made changes to trying to match more autofill players versus each other and secondary role players versus secondary role players. And there's two things that seem to be broken about this, actually. Number one is it seems like it's just, and this is anecdotal experience, I don't have stats like I do on the blue side, red side thing, but my anecdotal experience is that players are getting filled or put into a secondary role more often, especially in Masters Plus and in high elo, because what they're doing is they're forcing players to get filled more frequently so that they can put a filled player versus a filled player rather than actually like waiting until there's another filled player available. And so in my opinion, what we're actually seeing is more people being pushed into their secondary role so that the game is somewhat fair. But this creates kind of a conundrum or a problem, which is it better to have games that are quote unquote fairer because there's one second role player on one team and one second role player on another team, or one autofill on one team and one autofill on the other team? Or does that create actually quite imbalanced games where it's going to be determined by who is able to stomp the autofilled player the hardest? And I think that's one of the worries, is just because you have a game where there's one autofill player on each team doesn't really mean that the game is balanced, because if you have a player who is in a matchup where they can be heavily abused, or a role that's particularly bad for your team, like jungle, you're still going to be seeing a lot of situations where these autofill games, even if there's better parity, are just coming down to who's able to stomp that player harder. And so I wouldn't exactly call a game where like you have a master 400 LP top laner versus like some guy who's never played top in his life. And then on the other team, they have like a mid laner who's 400 LP and he's stomping some guy who has never played mid lane in his life. And I think we talked about this exact same scenario when we talked about the initial change, that, that might not be the best outcome for game quality for all of the players involved, even though technically it's more balanced or more fair. The other issue with this, which is I think quite a huge problem, is I pointed out as a climbing strategy that maybe people could look to queue a role other than their main role as their primary role, and then put their main role as their secondary role, and then either dodge almost all of the time or all of the time that they get the role that they put as their main. So for example, for me, I'm a support player. Imagine if instead of queuing support and then mid, I put mid and then support. Well, because support is not a very popular role, I'm actually going to get support like 30-40% of the time, even if I put it secondary. What that means is that when I do get support, that 30-40% of those games that I get support, I'm going to have a much higher chance of winning because I'm likely to be playing now versus someone on the other team. May not be in my role, but someone on the other team is very likely to get smashed because they're autofilled, whereas I'm actually just cheating the system because I'm actually on roll. and you could just dodge all your games mid, or if you had two roles that you were able to play decently well, you could really use that to gain some sort of advantage. So again, just as a little thought experiment here, it is anecdotal, but I was doing pretty bad on my main champion, which is Braum here. Went on a pretty bad losing streak, and I ended up, kind of doing what a lot of people do, and you shouldn't do this, but I ended up panicking and switching the champions that I was playing, and it started off innocently enough. I started playing Janna, and just kind of switching to a different support champion. Fine, fair enough. Feel like some of the enchanter items are really strong. But what's really interesting here is that I started actually changing after the Syndra game that I lost very badly, which I should have dodged. I don't really play mid, but I queue mid secondary like a lot of people because it's one of the most popular roles, and so you're less likely to get it, even though I'm not actually very good at mid. So I decided to put AD carry secondary, because that's a role that I'm a little bit more comfortable on, have practiced a little bit more. Well, wouldn't you know it, again, it's a small sample size of games, but I was also a little bit lower MMR than I normally am because of this losing streak. So maybe that made my games a little bit easier. But I mean, I'm just absolutely popping off on AD carry. And part of the reason why I want to talk about this is because I want to, look, I went 3-9 in my last game on AD carry. I think we can tell it's me. Don't want people thinking that I'm boosted because all of a sudden there's this cracked Kai'Sa player playing on my account. But yeah, that's me. So, I just panicked and stopped playing Braum. Obviously, you can see I'm like 2-8 in my last 10 games on Braum. Don't do this. In general, when you go on a losing streak or when you hit a tough spot in your climb, or when you kind of peak out and you're not really making any progress and you get hard stuck, it's really easy to blame your champion or the meta and want to switch what you're doing. But obviously I'm much better at Braum than I am at anything else, especially than playing another role like AD carry. But people will switch because they feel like if something's going wrong, they need to change something. That's sort of true. And obviously I wasn't playing well in these Braum games, but the thing that I need to change is I need to take my Braum to the next level and improve the consistency in the way that I'm playing the game on Braum. If I switch to a champion, even in support like Janna, that I'm not as familiar with, not as comfortable with, obviously I should just do worse. One of the reasons why this is probably working out is because of the fact that, like I said, I had lost so many games anyways that it's working out well. But I decided to use this as a little bit of an experiment because I realized after queuing my first two games and winning them on Janna that if I'm going to be, playing something that I probably shouldn't be playing anyways, while I'm climbing back, why not just kind of test this theory that I had after the last patch about, what's going on with secondary role. And so the first two games I queued for support mid and just got support. Then this Kai'Sa game was a perfect example, although it's just one game, of me queuing support with bot secondary, and I got AD carry secondary, and we absolutely stomped the enemy team. It was a very easy game, and as my teammates who played with me during this period can testify to, they would say I don't have hands, so they would probably not believe that it's me if they saw me going 8-1-9 on Kai'Sa. So something is weird there, like the game is just too easy because I'm secondary role. And I just happen to be decent enough from practicing Kai'Sa on my AD carry account that apparently it's working well. Plus it feels really nice to play with a 400 LP support player as opposed to playing, in like Emerald or Low Diamond with the support. So, this actually went really well. The next game I was still queuing support bot and got support, did really well on Janna and won again. Then the game after this, I was queuing support bot again, so I got AD carry secondary. I lost the game, and I could have played better, and it was a little bit more difficult than the first game, and my team didn't end up like showing up and doing that well. But I actually did a lot better than I thought that I would, and I think that again comes down to the fact that probably the game was easier than it should have been, because of the fact that I had this secondary role and somebody else on the other team was filled, which in this case was their mid laner, was an AD carry player. for example. And then, in this next game, I actually queued, starting at this point, I queued bot with support secondary. So there shouldn't really be any, advantage for queuing bot here, because I was queuing bot primary, but did really well in this game and won. Here is actually another game where I should have had the advantage because it was my secondary role. I did okay. I could have played better, but we did not win. And then this game was another game where I was queuing bot primary with support secondary, so I'm getting my primary role here, so it's not exactly an example of a secondary role game. In fact, of all of these games, even though it is impressive that I just switched what champion and role I was playing, and won, let's see, it's 6 out of my last 8 games, only 3 of these games were on secondary role. This Kaisa game where I went 8-1-9, this Kaisa game where I went 6-4-5, and this Jana game where I went 3-5-14. And although I did well in all of these games, I actually went 1-2. Although again, it's a very, very low sample size. So that actually seems to suggest that the secondary role thing isn't that OP. But we'll have to see. And I'll keep experimenting with this since I'm kind of tilt queuing anyways. So this is really anecdotal, but it seems to me like queuing for your main role secondary, obviously I should, the strategy behind that, and I can show it here, is let's say that I queue support and mid, which is what I would normally do. And what I would do is I would dodge every time that I get mid, and so I'd end up playing support 100% of the time. That's the second number here. And then the first number is the win rate. So let's say if I actually played out my mid games, I might win 30% of my mid games, whereas if I play support, I'm going to win 55% of my support games. The result, if I actually dodge all of my mid games, would be about a 55% win rate. If I queue bot lane and then support, we're going to expect my win rate on support to go up drastically because I'm pretty much guaranteed to be playing versus some sort of autofill player or secondary role player in some position on the enemy team. So let's say that I get support 40% of the time and win 70% of the time on it, and I get bot lane 60% of the time and win 50% of my games on bot primary because I'm okay at bot lane. I end up with a 58% win rate, which is actually higher than if I queued for my main role primary. But it depends on what the numbers are, right? If I wasn't able to win 70% of my support games secondary, then this could well be worse than queuing support mid. Another situation is that I could, of course, just queue support primary, but then play something like bot lane or, AD carry secondary. And because I'm better at AD carry secondary than I am at mid, the advantage that I would have from it being secondary might be big enough that even if I would win 55% of my games on support and only 50% or maybe 48% of my games on AD carry, my win rate on AD carry might shoot up to more like 55% when I'm playing it in a secondary role, because of the fact that we have that advantage from somebody on the other team, being off-rolled. Now, here's another really interesting thing. Of course, the best strat would actually be to take this strategy right here, but then reduce the amount of games that I'm actually playing bot lane to 0 by dodging all of those games. Now that would mean that I'm dodging 60% of my games, which would mean I wouldn't be able to play on the account very much, but my MMR would constantly be going up, and so there'd be no penalty for your MMR for doing this. So obviously this would result in a much higher win rate on the account, much higher MMR. Eventually you would get really big LP gains, or you could even just boost your MMR essentially to Challenger from Masters or from low GM. And then I could just switch back to queuing support primary when I wanted to play all of those games. And if I was able to hang in that MMR, I'd use the high MMR from the account in order to climb to Challenger. The other thing that's really interesting about this is, let's say I don't quite want to commit to dodging 60% of my games. Let's say I actually want to play, some percentage of my bot games, but we want to reduce it from, me playing 60% of my games on AD carry to me playing only like 30% of my games on AD carry. Well, one thing that I could do in combination with the blue side versus red side thing is imagine every time I get AD carry on on blue side, I dodge, or actually it would be on the red side on this patch, since blue side has a higher win rate. What we'd essentially do is we get a kind of a 2-for-1 with our dodge, which is we get to dodge a game that we're less likely to win because we're getting our main role that's not really our main role. And we're also dodging a game where we're on the red side that has, you know, a 46.5% chance of winning. And so we're kind of getting a 2-for-1 deal with that. So even if you didn't want to commit fully to, you know, queuing for a role that you don't main, and then like queuing support, in my case, let's say secondary, you know, and then dodging every role or every game you get your primary role, one thing that you could do instead is you could just dodge all of the games that you get red side on that main role that you don't actually main. And that would be quite a good effective climbing strategy. So, you know, obviously Riot should fix this. I'm going to, at least while I'm continuing to tilt queue, I'm going to continue to queue bot and support secondary and see how it goes. I will report back when I have some more data on how this is going for me. You know, I'm not really full into dodging. I've just been playing the 80 carry games out. Maybe if the 80 carry games start going poorly, I'll start dodging, but we'll see how this goes. Riot needs to do something to prevent this from becoming a serious problem. Good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.